Growing up being a rock and metal guitar player, there's a very high chance that you've probably came across the name of Randy Rhoads. In the 1980s, there were many great shredders: Michael Schenker, Jason Becker, Paul Gilbert, Marty Friedman, but among these guitarists was Randy Rhoads, a guitarist who had a very short amount of time to make a huge impact on the world of heavy metal. You know, back then we weren't really used to rock and metal using different scales, diminished chords, harmonic minor scale, some different modes. It was mostly the pentatonic scale, the blues scale. And we weren't getting these really interesting harmonic tonalities that Randy Rhoads brought to the table. Coming from the late 1970s, most people were used to things like blues rock and hard rock, and as we know now, of classic rock. With Randy Rhoads breaking through at such a young age, he was able to bring a lot of neoclassical aspects into the music theory of the genre of heavy metal. Randy Rhoads grew up in a household of musicians. That's the first thing that people really need to understand, is that since his mom was a piano player, she was a professional piano player, she opened up a music school, and Randy was taking guitar lessons for classical and folk sort of style guitar since he was 7 years old. Randy got the upper hand by playing guitar at such a young age simply because he grew up in a family of musicians, since his mom being a full-time piano player and his whole family being involved in music. He had that upper hand right from the beginning. They were based in northern Hollywood area, so they were already in that music scene, and when she opened up this music school, Randy Rhoads kind of had it really nice, where he got to learn guitar and classical and theory really quickly from his mother. Now, Randy Rhoads did have a guitar teacher, but this was only for a short amount of time because Randy accelerated at an extremely fast rate, and soon the teacher had to inform to his mother that he could not teach him anymore because he has surpassed the skills of himself. Now, if I had to take my guess, this guitar teacher most likely didn't have as good of an understanding of music theory as Randy did, as he was brought up by his mother in classical music. Randy would still continue to learn and practice the guitar at the school, but of course soon he needed to form a band to really take his career to the next level, as he was already being influenced by classic rock like the Beatles. So Randy did end up meeting someone named Kelly Garney, and Kelly Garney was basically someone who he taught how to play bass back in the day, and they eventually formed Quiet Riot before playing in a bunch of cover bands. Okay, so that was kind of the big thing, as it kind of still is now, where you learn how to play an instrument and then you make a cover band. Now, as a lot of us know, being in a band in middle school is the equivalent to an infant trying to ride a two-wheeler bike. It usually just doesn't go very well, but here's the thing that people fail to understand. If you start playing music in a band at a young age, and you even get the chance to play shows at such a young age, you get that extra exposure and you get that extra practice playing in front of people at a young age, so that way by the time you are in high school, in your teens, you basically can accelerate even faster as a band and as a musician, because you've already gotten rid of some of those weaknesses when you were a lot younger. And now by the time the mid-70s hit, Quiet Riot was doing pretty good with Randy, okay? They were playing a lot of shows in the California scene, and of course it was a pretty big rock scene, a really good hard rock scene in California, especially in the Hollywood area. And this did really help Randy and Quiet Riot, because eventually they did land a record deal in the 1970s. But it wasn't too long after that Randy sort of realized that this band wasn't working out, as he had some issues with Kelly, his old friend from middle school. And as soon as he heard that Ozzy Osbourne was no longer in Black Sabbath, he took the opportunity to audition for Ozzy Osbourne's solo project. Now, to be frank, the audition was insane. Randy showed up and started warming up for about 10 seconds, and then Ozzy immediately gave him the job. Now, of course, this was at the time where Ozzy was notoriously known for being a little under the influence, if you know what I mean. But even then, it was still enough to blow him away, because there were other guitarists who did audition for Ozzy at the time, but Randy was the one who stuck out, and Ozzy made a very good decision in hiring him right away. And thus became the birth of two amazing albums, Blizzard of Oz and Diary of a Madman. Randy coming into the world of heavy metal with a huge knowledge on music theory and a huge background of classical music. It was inevitable that they would take off right away. The heavy metal and hard rock scene was mostly filled with basic chords, pentatonic scales, and there was nothing that was really super harmonically crisp outside of the things that we're used to with things like Led Zeppelin and the Beatles. People just weren't using cooler stuff in their harmonies, okay, in rock and metal. Everything was the same. There were very few exceptions to this, okay? And Randy Rhoads really took things to another level. So the first riff that we're going to talk about is Crazy Train. So Crazy Train basically makes really good use of the minor sixth interval, okay? So the minor sixth interval is basically if we're in a minor key and we go up a sixth, there's your minor sixth interval, okay? It has a very dissonant sound to it. The minor sixth interval is nothing new. It's been used for centuries, but the thing is, in rock and metal, we haven't really gotten too much a dissonance like the minor sixth interval. And the main thing that I noticed about the Crazy Train riff is the fact that it influenced a lot of heavy metal going on for generations in the future. A good example of this would be a comparison to Eurythmics' 1983 song, Sweet Dreams. Being that Crazy Train only came out a couple of years prior to this, Sweet Dreams has a very similar feel to it in terms of the repeating eighth notes on the synthesizer, while also making use of the minor sixth. The main differences with Sweet Dreams, of course, is that we do explore other diatonic chords in the key of C minor, whereas in Crazy Train in the riff, we're mostly exploring F minor and A major. But what's interesting is if I transpose the Sweet Dreams synthesizer lick from C minor to F sharp minor, let's see if it sounds any similar to Crazy Train. Yeah, it sounds pretty close, but I still don't think it has that exact same feel, and of course this isn't anything that would be considered copying, but the main thing is that in rock and metal, people were starting to use more interesting stuff as soon as Randy started bringing these to the table. Another set of proof that I have is just looking at the genre now called metalcore. In metalcore, the minor sixth interval is perhaps the most common interval in this entire genre. Just listen to these riffs with the minor sixth interval. Now, a common thing that a lot of composers back in the day use is something called relative keys. They'll basically take a phrase and then they'll play a very similar phrase in another key, but usually in the relative major if you're in a minor key. Think of something like Fair-Elise. You have your main motif that gets played and repeated a couple of times in the key of A minor. But then, going forward, there is a second motif that's very similar in the key of C major. The riff is only two measures. In the second measure, you can argue that he was morely going into A major because of that cadential E as the last note. Now, all a relative key is basically when you have a minor key and a major key and they share the same key signature. If you have something like the key of F sharp minor that has 3 sharps, if you go up 3 frets or 3 half steps, you're at the key of A major. That would be the easiest way of finding your relative key. Now, even though Crazy Train was their most commercially successful hit at the time, this does not compare to some of the genius that Randy Rhoads brought to the table in the rest of the album and into the next album. Mr. Crowley, being one of their other hits on Blizzard of Oz, is a great example of this. So Mr. Crowley starts with this very dark melodic organ work. Now this organ work mostly uses diatonic chords, okay? And there's only a couple chords in there that's not diatonic, okay? But it sounds very classical because the timbre of the organ but also a couple of the chords in there, like the dominant 7th chord. Since we're in D minor, we've got an A7 in there, and there's also a minor 2 chord instead of using our typical diminished or half diminished 2 chord. Mr. Crowley is another great example of making use of relative keys. Mr. Crowley is in the key of D minor. It is often argued that some of the song goes to F major, especially in the verse, because Randy's constant use of the B flat major chord and the C major chord. This would basically imply that we'd be in F minor and we'd be playing a subdominant to a dominant chord in the key of F major. Now, going into the interlude of the song, it's really important to look at this part because of the use of intervals of thirds and fifths. Since he made a really nice melody going over the main chord progression, they sounded really nice with a nice diatonic harmony. But the big aspect of Mr. Crowley that most people recognize it for is the guitar solos. The first solo is basically filled with mostly pentatonic and natural minor runs in the key of D minor going over a basic D minor chord progression. But once we start getting to the second solo, he's playing arpeggios in triplets going right alongside the proper chords that are playing in the rhythm guitar. Hearing this, you can definitely tell that this is very classically influenced, as you can definitely hear a pianist playing the chords in the left hand in the bass while playing these arpeggios in the right hand. Going through the rest of the tracks in the album, there is one song that sticks out to me that is the most neoclassical song on the entire record, and it really shows his true genius, that song being titled Revelation Mother Earth. So the beginning of the song has a very similar reflection of a Francisco Tarrega etude. In terms of its style, the etude of Francisco Tarrega does sound very similar to Revelation Mother Earth, but obviously there are some notable differences, but the biggest one being Randy's flat 5, aka the note B flat. So this is where our secondary dominant theory comes in with Randy Rhoads, because he's a really big fan of secondary dominant style chords. Okay, so listen to this real quick. See, being in the key of E minor, the only accidental that we have in the key signature is F sharp. But a very common thing that heavy metal musicians will do is they will flat the 5 to add an extra really dark sound, such as the tritone. You can listen to Enter Sandman in the main riff, and they do the exact same thing in the key of E minor, playing a B flat. A lot of classical composers would do this, where they would flat the 5 and they would sort of signal and reflect that secondary dominant chord. The tritone being mainly popularized by the metal band Black Sabbath on their self-titled song Black Sabbath was a really good way of getting that nice dark tone for heavy metal, as the rumor of it being banned by the church back in the Age of Faith, even though this was proven to be a huge myth, it still does resonate that really dark essence in heavy metal. And in this case, Randy made a really good use of it, being the song very biblical called Revelation. When you flat the 5 in using a scale, especially the harmonic minor scale, your scale is basically turning into what we call Hungarian minor or double harmonic minor, where you're basically sharping the 4 or flatting the 5. And in that case, that sort of gives us a secondary dominant feel within the chord progression. And in general, the verse has some really spicy chromaticism and some other really nice chords in general. Like there's a 7 of 5 chord, which would be an A major chord. Okay, so this symbolizes some really nice fresh cadences in these licks and in these riffs. And Randy Rhoads was a master at cadences and really dark and awesome sounding cadences. If you listen to the section after the interlude with the piano and classical guitar part, which is sounding very nice, by the way, listen to the part where it starts doing the drum accents. It's almost as if you can picture a symphony doing like a bum, dun, ba ba dum, ba da dun. It's kind of like that sort of feel. It's almost as if this whole song is one giant symphony with things like the classical guitar, with things like the piano, and things like the tubular bell or the orchestral chimes, as they call it, with also the very biblical-esque lyrics from Ozzy. But of course, it wouldn't be an Ozzy song without the completion of a guitar solo. And the guitar solo of Revelation is extremely neoclassical. The use of trills is a very common aspect of pianists back in the classical days. Think of piano composers like Frédéric Chopin. With his nocturnes, there's a lot of trills that accent really beautiful motifs and cadences and things like that. And it's a really good way to usually make use of half steps, but they do also work really nicely for whole steps. And in this case, what Randy did was he outlined the E harmonic minor scale. Now with this album, it does feature a solo classical piece that Randy Rhoads on behalf of his mother called D. The key itself, reflecting the song title in the key of D major, kind of entails some very pretty classical elements, and it really showed how Randy knew how to compose for classical guitar. It's really, really nice because it kind of mimics a little bit of something that Bach would do. It kind of mimics the Bach Brouwer in E minor. Check this out. And it's really cool because in this piece, he does use a 5 of 2 chord, so more secondary dominant. We're in the key of D major. We would go to E, and then we go up a 5th from E, so we'd have a nice B7 chord, and it really did make a nice cadence for that. Now, in only a handful of weeks, Ozzy Osbourne and the band recorded Diary of a Madman and was released in 1981, and this was critically acclaimed as one of Ozzy's best albums of all time. Diary of a Madman is front to back an incredible record, and I think a lot of that has to do with Randy's incredible harmonic tonality and melodic phrasing. So the first track on the record, Over the Mountain, features a flat 2 in the key of G minor, which in that turn would be A flat. The flat 2, similar to the flat 5, also does give a very dissonant sound. On this record, some of the more obscure tracks that don't really get talked about, honestly, are some of the coolest in my opinion. And more of that flat 5 does come up in the song Believer, okay? Since we're in the key of E flat major, there's a very abrupt and blunt A natural in there instead of a B flat, right? So we have another flat 5. The song Little Dolls explores B flat minor until we hit the interlude where we start getting a little bit more spicy with the chords. In A flat major, we're doing a 1, we're doing a 4 add 11, and then we're doing a minor 4 add 11. So more chord borrowing and more non-functional harmony from Randy that sounds really, really nice. Parallel keys are used when you go from straight minor key and borrowing from the parallel major key. So if we were in the key of A flat minor, our 4 chord would be minor, but if we were in the key of A flat major, our 4 chord would be major. So essentially, you're just borrowing a chord from that parallel key. Now, to get to the meat of the bones here, we need to talk about the song itself, Diary of a Madman. The best way to describe the intro to Diary of a Madman is peculiar, not just for the chords, but for something else. So now a musician and guitar teacher named David Schramm made a very interesting article covering something that a few people in the world noticed, but not very many people knew about this. So now the first measure in Diary of a Madman basically makes use of an A7 sharp 4 chord. Now this chord, along with some of the other chords in this intro, were pointed towards a composer by the name of Leo Brouwer. Now, Leo Brouwer being a Cuban composer from kind of around the time that Randy would have heard of this classical guitarist, it very much influenced this song. Leo's piece being his 6th etude. There are some, well, similarities to his chord progression next to Randy's Diary of a Madman. Let's check it out. First 7 measures, those chords are almost exactly the same and they sound extremely similar. Now they of course lead to different things, but since Randy was brought up with classical guitar and he was even taking classical lessons while he was on the road touring, it's not very surprising that he has all of these extra added little things from classical pieces. Now here's where things get a little bit rocky and shaky, is that a lot of people think that this was plagiarism or copying. Now, I've brought this up with my own classical guitar teacher because when I heard about this, I was like, oh my goodness, is this true? When I brought it up, my guitar teacher did end up saying that, yeah, and Leo Brouwer did know about it, and he was going to perhaps pursue legal action towards Randy, but Randy did end up passing away, so he ended up kind of dropping it. Now, I couldn't really find anything that exactly confirmed or denied this, but it is very interesting to see how similar these two sound. The main takeaway that I think people forget to understand is the fact that these chords probably would have never seen the light of day to most hard rock and heavy metal musicians at this time. And in general, I think it actually gave Mr. Leo Brouwer some more extra exposure, and it also promoted classical guitar to a lot of heavy metal fans and players. We need to move forward with a little bit more classical influence of Randy with this same exact song. Back to the Francisco Tarrega, he does end up using sort of a very similar bass line to his famous Recuerdos de la Alhambra, which is one of the most famous classical guitar pieces of all time. Recuerdos de la Alhambra makes use of tremolo in classical guitar. It's basically when your ring finger, middle finger, and your index finger, aka AMI, sequentially hits higher notes while the thumb is able to hit a nice bass line. And this sequence is a little more subtle with Diary of a Madman, as in after the intro into the A flat minor lick, we can basically hear the same bass line in both pieces. All right, that's enough Randy Rhoads classical and metal stuff, okay? So I think we really got the gist that Randy Rhoads was crazy about his classical music and he implemented it into his metal. And I hope you guys can take some of this stuff and start using it into your own shredding, into your own composing and all that good stuff. And I will see you guys next time.